IQ. And I'll say something more about what geneticity means and ask for some audience participation on making some estimates on this, because I believe in this area there is a deplorable lack of objectivity in the intellectual community. I think we're seeing evidence of substitution of logical processes. They're being substituted by other ones. I've had that experience before, and I think it is a deplorable thing. The title which the Public Relations Office gave in response to my question was Race Superiority. This title, I presume, was distributed by the same group who are exhibiting statements now. The issue, the principal issue in which my activities are involved is basically a moral issue, and one which I feel essentially calls for reappraisal of ethics and possibly even some religious aspects. I have been exposed to reactions such as we're encountering this afternoon. They bother me somewhat, but so far as having any doubt as to whether or not I'm doing one of the most constructive things I can do, that doubt becomes progressively less and less as time goes on, and especially as I observe the types of reactions that I get from some of the people who should be intellectual leaders in the academic community.
Well, is it the case that you're not a fascist? Come on.
I am now going to put on the role, which I think is appropriate, and is appropriate in response to that question, of becoming a preacher. And I shall start by reading a statement which I think expresses the views of those who have the most objections to my being here today, but is put in much better language and by a man whom I think is probably more dispassionate, probably better educated. His name was Lincoln Richardson, although I did not know that when I first got a copy of his editorial in Presbyterian Life for 15 October 71, called Saturday Thoughts. I called up Mr. Richardson because it seemed to me this was an opportunity to make a response, which I did make, and which I shall present to you this morning as a foundation for getting into this fussy area that we're going to deal with. Mr. Richardson's column was headed An American Final Solution. I take it that the people who are comparing me with a fascist and a Nazi know what that phrase means. They ought to. This was Hitler's answer to the Jewish question. The final solution was Dachau. The editor of Presbyterian Life did not know that that was what an American final solution meant. When I called him up, although I did not say so, he may have been sufficiently perceptive to realize that he had clearly published something that was libelous. I didn't raise that point because I regarded this as an opportunity, just as I regarded it as an opportunity this morning, or this noon, this early afternoon, to attempt to deal constructively with the type of objection that you see running freely around the group here. I think the reaction that we find of the SDS students is quite in keeping with how they should react on the basis of a distorted impression that is being given to them by the anthropologists and the psychologists and the social scientists about what are some of the fundamentals of man as a type of mammalian life on Earth. Well, let me now... Man is a mammal and subject to nature's biologic laws like other mammals. And we are unwittingly, in my opinion, playing God by having interfered with the natural laws of selection and evolution. This is humane. This is an objective of civilization. But civilized people also have the objective, they should have the obligation, for which I'm calling, to look at this analytically and see what they're doing. The statement that I make, in which I believe, is that at the present time, by following the course I am following, in respect to the most disadvantaged in our nation, be they black or white or any other color, by looking at the profound evil, the form of genetic enslavement that may be inflicted upon them by our sanctimoniously backed welfare programs, which may be encouraging the least competent elements of both blacks and whites and other colors to have the most children. And if one understands what is the main subject of my talk today, the geneticity of IQ, that is the degree to which IQ is controlled by the genes, then one will realize that this irresponsibility on the part of our intellectuals in failing to look at this is quite at a par with the failure of the German intellectuals to look at what was happening to the Jews. I'm sure they made all sorts of excuses as to how the Jews were going home to visit their families in Poland or other places. Well, let me now come to what Mr. Richardson says about Shockley. I'm sure some of you will enjoy this. What is truly shocking about these schemes is that people who dream them up feel quite free to present them to the public without any guile. He's talking about me, you see. To call them by their rightful, if nasty, names, schemes of sterilization and other kinds of birth control for whole groups of people, propose exactly genocide. The latest such proposal comes from Dr. William Shockley, an electrical engineer who won a Nobel Prize for helping to invent the transistor. He has suggested that the government give bonuses for sterilization, but only for dumb people. Dumb people is defined by the dubious method of IQ testing. He suggests that people be given a $1,000 bonus for every point below a score of 100 on an IQ test. Before running out to flunk an IQ test, though, please note that you don't actually get the money. I'm putting the emphasis in as Richardson has it in his italics. If you are lucky enough to score, say, 70, what you get is a $30,000 trust fund. The fund of spending it on your behalf presumably goes to your betters. My intent is that to protect such an individual from the loss of these funds, the income from a trust fund is the sensible means to take. One of the last times when one of these operations, and I'm giving still a 2-to-1 chance this lecture will come off, at Wright College, I invited one of the spokesmen for the SDS up onto the stage to argue. And I am in some negotiations with Marty Reif, with whom I have become acquainted by telephone, and it is my anticipation I shall go back in due course and meet with the Harvard-Radcliffe SDS group. Shockley made his proposal at a meeting of the American Psychological Association. Here is Shockley with his PhD telling all those psychologists with their PhDs that what we need is fewer of them in this world. We would like to report that Shockley's genocidal proposal discriminates only against those with low IQs, for it would keep the issue clean. We could simply point to his incredible arrogance as a man of intelligence, but we must report that Shockley is a self-revealed and unashamed racist. For starters, he is convinced that Negroes are less intelligent than whites, but that they benefit greatly from white genes when they are fortunate enough to inherit them. My published statement is that it is not my position that all blacks are inferior to all whites. In fact, my statistical studies show that there are many blacks superior to many whites. What they show is that in certain areas they definitely outperform whites, and if some of you want to see slides that I don't have on, that I don't plan to show during the lecture afterwards, I will show you the interesting data that shows black visual acuity in the draft board test is as if they were pushed up by 0.6 of a standard deviation in the visual acuity curve, so far as escaping bad vision, such as 20/40, 20/60, up to 2200. So far as that goes, they're definitely moved upwards in visual acuity compared to whites. As if it applied to IQ, it would be about 9 IQ points. He does not comment on whether black genes give you rhythm, make you good at singing, dancing, and sports, or make you happy-go-lucky. Mr. Richardson simply has not read my writings. I deal with some of these points. And I do find the superiority. But race aside, the suggestion that we ought to be done with the bottom half of the IQ ladder is not only outrageously arrogant, unfeeling, and dangerous, it is also simply wrong-headed. Dull people don't organize famines. They don't go to colleges and lead riots. They don't manipulate the dollar flow and stock market and gross national product from recession to inflation and back. They don't draw up elaborate bureaucratic papers that show how a country can gain a little prestige through the expenditure of only a few thousand lives. Well, so much for Mr. Richardson. I shall now come to my reply. By title, An American Final Solution, and by text, the Saturday Thoughts of October 15, 1971, characterized me as a disciple of Hitler. His final solution was Dachau. And it is, of course, I think, obvious that the SDS is fitting into the pattern of the Nazi youth and is not replacing preconceived notions, a shutting out of the minds, and an unwillingness to look at those things for which our Constitution was set up, so that the same kind of harms can be done, or similar harms can be done by them, unless there is a return to the principles which I recall seeing over the auditorium of the University of California at Los Angeles when I went there in 1927 on the Vermont campus, then called the Southern Branch. And in front of that auditorium was a very simple statement which I hope is somewhere in an auditorium here, which is that education consists of learning to use the tools the race has found indispensable. And one of those, all races that have reached civilized status have found one of the most important tools is truth. And my title, well, Mr. Elias, there is some question in my mind as to whether this is worth continuing. And questions I have found from past experience are useless under these circumstances where I recognize so well the symptoms of the audience. Nobody listens to what is said. All they do is to come up and shoot the next question. It'll probably be one I've heard before. I think I shall continue to read my three moral postulates. Can I have a showing of hands of people who an reasonably vigorous waving of hands of people who want me to continue and want to hear what I have to say? Can I have a similar? May I photograph this? Well, this, you realize, is a serious subject like what are really fundamental moralities, and the type of reaction we're getting now poses the question of whether or not one is self-defeating by trying to talk about it. I turn this over in my mind. I decide I shall try anyway. The three moral postulates that I talk about in this Presbyterian Life letter that I wrote are called truth, concern, death. And the truth postulate is one that I held to be self-evident. I think it's a basic humanistic instinct. It's the thing that underlies civilizations. It means to me, the truth postulate can be put by saying the truth shall make you free, means that man has an obligation to endeavor to use his intelligence to understand and to solve such quantities as the ones I'm trying to face, human quality problems. Now, these postulates, as I stated them, truth, concern, death, I have tried to make general in the sense that Einstein used when he invented the word invariant in relativity theory. Invariant things, as Einstein invented them, were observations which would be observed the same way, found to obey the same law, no matter how rapidly the observers were moving in respect to each other. Einstein's great invention on this was that a basic law of nature was that you couldn't tell how fast you were moving. And from that, and some very simple Newtonian laws, out drops the E equals mc squared, which I'm sure many people feel is a terrible thing for mankind to have discovered, because if we had not discovered it, we would not have atomic bombs, and we would have a lot more smoke, and we would have a lot more problems with our reserve fossil supply for energy in the future. Well, so much for the invariance principle as Einstein put it. To me, the invariance principle says that man's obligation to use his brain is an equally significant obligation, whether man's brain was placed in his head when God created him in his own image in the Garden of Eden, or whether it was developed by the evolution of territorially united weapon-using apes, as Ardrey describes in African Genesis. Those apes who are more skillful in using weapons, more ingenious, would survive against duller apes. And therefore, if that is the case, then the instinct to use the brain was based on evolution and is a purely humanistic, basic animal instinct. But I think this same evolutionary mechanism, which selected for intelligence, also selected for humaneness. Those human tribes who cared more about their children, about their wounded, about their farm and battle animals, who had this basic concern with the feelings of fellow creatures, those individuals would be more successful in killing off their less humane competitors. So I think humaneness, whether one believes that it came from God or from evolution, is an understandable human trait. And that brings me to the second of my three moral postulates, the concern postulate. I state that one this way. The basis for a humane civilization is man's concern for his fellow creatures. And I've described how that could have arisen. A cat is different. A cat will torture a mouse, and this is natural an evolutionary basis. The cat would be much less able to survive if it felt concern for the feelings of the mouse when it was keeping its catching skills in practice and properly attuned. The concern postulate, as I put it, is I regard as a deep and fundamental principle, and one which bears precisely on the concerns I have for what may be happening to the unfortunate ghetto youth, again regardless of color, but most severely disadvantaged for the black minority. And this concern is for the poor child who may be brought into the world by improvident parents and encouraged, quite possibly, by our well-intentioned welfare programs which we don't look at objectively. And this is condemning a group to some agony in the future. And at this point, I would like to read from a paper of mine a statement that I quoted from the NAACP's labor director, Herbert Hill. This particular section of a Kaplan article, and incidentally, one thing I should tell you all is this written material is available on request in limited quantities and with financial support with essentially unlimited quantities by writing to me at Stanford at Post Box S for Shockley or Stanford, or if you simply address it to Shockley at Stanford. Well, the NAACP's director, labor director, Herbert Hill, told the annual NAACP convention this: the rates of unemployment among black youth have now reached disaster levels, and if they continue, virtually an entire generation of ghetto youth will never enter the labor force. Their only future will be a marginal, alienated existence, separate and unusual within American society. Mr. Hill's concern, I now quote from my article, is concern concern over black unhappiness is supported by a Gallup poll of 1,517 adults. Very happy was the response of 46% of whites, but only 20% of non-whites. That is, Gallup asked them, are you very happy, happy, or not happy? I dare say the same laugh would come up if one said that the mole of the gram atom is defined as 603 times 10 to the 23rd atoms. And the basis for this is, which they will certainly not be able to answer if they've taken any, nor will most of the chemists, the basis for this is one chose the edge of the centimeter to be at the length it has, so that it can, and that defines 1 gram of water. If the centimeter had been different, it would not have been 606 times 10 to the 23rd. But I'll continue with Mr. Gallup's report. I don't think it's funny myself. I think this is exactly the tragedy the nation is facing, and it is to be thought of and analyzed and not laughed at or scoffed at. There is wisdom, there is another well-known principle, and that is there's sometimes wisdom from the mouth of babes. Those who have least respect for what I say and regard me as being completely unqualified for what I'm talking about should look at the data and endeavor to analyze it. That is your intellectual obligation as students. But Gallup examined 1,517 adults. Very happy was the response of 46% of whites, but of only 20% of non-whites. That is, the ratio of those who thought they were very happy was 2 to 1, almost 2.5 to 1 for whites. Not happy percentages were 5% for whites and 12% for blacks. These quantitative findings are relevant to the tragic disadvantages of the black minority, and to fail to analyze them and to attempt to stop analysis or demands for inquiry simply by name calling and shouting is a dereliction of intellectual responsibility, and I find this among important and outstanding academicians whom one would think would be far more objective. Well, now the third moral postulate you might want to know about, as well as the concerned one. This took me some time, and I think I understand it, and I think I'm sincere in it. This is death. Truth concerned death. During the last rational 5 minutes of my life, should I happen to have my intellectual powers intact, I hope to be able to look back and think, since I have engaged in this campaign, that I have been using my capacities close to their maximum potential in keeping with objectives like those of Nobel's will of conferring greatest benefit on mankind. And that is why this type of attack is so relatively undisturbing to me. I don't detect reason in it. I don't detect anything that does anything other than support my views on this point further. Now, the point that I was going to talk about technically and deal with, this geneticity of IQ, involves that overhead projector and is the manpower for dealing with this equipment on hand. I want also, is Jeff Grunfeld here? Expected him to be participating in this. And Mr. Gabe Elias, you can also lend a hand. You can draw the cards. Post Box S.
At Stanford?
At Stanford. Or simply Shockley at Stanford will do it.
Are you going to show your slides?
Well, I think I have slides arranged, but I have one of them, the first one, on here. Well, let's see. Could I have the first slide? And I think you can see it over this overhead projector. Now, this is the first one that produces thought blocks. Part of my.
Put the sign down so we can see it.
Let's see. Can somebody lift this thing and put it on the floor? You can do that, I think. I think it just lifts off. I'm not sure that the hand showing means anything in this group, but I'll do it again anyway, but I don't think it's worth trying to photograph. I recognize the sarcasm is pretty obvious. Could I have the slide off while I do this question now? This question has to do with geneticity of IQ. Geneticity of IQ is defined as the fraction of what pushes IQ around that is due to genes rather than due to environment. And my demonstration is going to involve this, and I'll take out my deck of cards for that purpose. We are later going to produce artificial individuals with this deck of cards, which has numbers on them rather than card faces. And if one draws 5 cards here, that represents accurately the way these cards are set up. It represents accurately the way IQ is distributed. That is, these cards are set up to give a normal distribution if you draw 5 cards with a standard deviation of 15. And that's how much typical populations spread their IQs out around 100. And we're going to look into the question later on of whether it is reasonable to say that 3 of those 5 cards should be attributed to genes, or 2 of those 5 cards should be attributed to genes and pushing the IQ around, and the other 3 to environment or other factors, and so on. Now, I'd like to ask how many people, in terms of their education or any other viewpoints they have, for white Caucasians, which is the group I'm going to talk about, how much of whatever pushes IQ around is genetic and how much is environmental? And I'm going to give three choices. A choice of how much are genes, how much are environment, or other things. I'm going to give three choices. Those who think that the genes do 33% of it, or range from 0 to 33, those who do from 33 to 67, and those who think is higher than that, and genes are really much more than half. They're somewhere between 67 and 100%. Could I have the showing of hands of people who believe genes are 33 or less percent of the story for white Caucasians and pushing IQ around? Well, this is a rather small group. I would say about 5% maybe or less is down in that range. How about the 33 to 67 range? Well, this is still very small. How about the 67 to 100%? Well, that's about 1. One of my standard questions I ask under these circumstances, could I have a showing of hands of the people who can't hear me? IQ tests. I am talking now about IQ tests. The second question of what do IQ tests have to do with things?
Sir, you're asking us to defend your theory.
I'm not asking you to defend my theory. I'm asking you, you know there is something called IQ. You may disagree with it, but nevertheless it exists as a measured thing. Well, I'm glad to hear somebody say that races exist, because you'll find many anthropologists who will talk about the myth of race and say they don't. Well, both things exist. And there's also raceology. And I regard myself as being in the area of raceology, and I think there is this moral obligation to understand any significant scientific differences in races and attempt to apply one's brains to them. Well, question period has been going on, and it's indistinguishable from what else is going on. Now then, I now will repeat this question regarding the relative importance of IQ versus the relative control of genes and environment and IQ. We're going to be talking about it later on for a certain group of Caucasians. And that's why we're going to be the main thesis of the main subject of the talk. How many think the genes have less than 33% of the effect on what pushes IQ score around? Well, this is of the order of 5%. How many think it has between 33 and 67%? That's about the same, maybe 5%. How many think it has more than 67, between 67 and 100? I'm going to show, well, how many, does anybody think it's more than 80%? The audience response here leads me to feel there's practically no chance of my...
How many people don't know? That's a fourth option. And that's what most of us fall into. How many people don't?
Now that is that comment I welcome very much. This is something I missed, and it's a good comment, and I buy it thoroughly. I hope you mean it as I received it. Could I ask you, do you really mean that sincerely, or are you...
We don't have preconceived notions.
Well,
Scientists, huh?
all right. Well, then how many of you, I'll ask this, how many of you have no notion as to what the answer to my question is, really? How many of you are interested in a reasoning and analysis as to how one comes to a conclusion? Well, that's the biggest showing of hands, and I am encouraged, and I thank you because I must say I was turning it over in my head then, that this might be a hopeless enough operation, so there's just really no point in continuing. But, all right, now could we have the overhead projector in the center? Oh, sorry, let's have that first slide again, then we'll have this, because it shows better on the slide than it will on the next one. Here is something which is surprising. I'll have it on the overhead projector, but it's not quite as easy to see, so you'll see it here first. This shows something that is very surprising to most people. Just a matter of curiosity, how many psychology majors are in the audience?
Just start talking about this.
Well, there are, well, that looks, if I call the others 5, that's more than 5%. This shows what we're going to analyze in more detail. There is an article which gives information on 122 individuals, and in a certain column on that article, there's a column of the IQs of these individuals. I want you to pretend that you put a piece of paper over that column so you can't see it. There are other columns, one of which gives the occupational class or the socioeconomic status of the family in which the child was raised. These are, in some cases, occupational class, sometimes socioeconomic status. We don't pay any attention to that. Question? These might be Stanford-Binet IQs or Wechsler's. They're of IQ tests which correlate rather highly with each other and the same sort of general scale as the Stanford-Binet. Now, what I will show you or tell you how to do a little later is this. You can look at these other columns, and from these columns, if you know how to do it, you can make a prediction of this, the IQ of this covered column, a prediction which you can make accurately if you assume that IQ is 100% genetically controlled. And if you'll look over there to the extreme right, the highest, or the point farthest to the right on that, you see the prediction was an IQ of 132, and the observed value was 131. There was a miss of 1 point. If the prediction had been perfect, the point would have been on that 45-degree line. What this shows you, well, here's another one down here where there was a prediction of about 63, and the measured value was maybe 73. And the worst miss of all is this particular point down there that has a fly speck on it, apparently. At 100 and predicted 116, measured 94. That happens to be a very famous prediction failure about which many of you probably heard. Now then, at this point, well, what you see is the range of predictions, and actually the range of observations, range all the way from a little below 70 to a little above 130. A swing of about 60 points. I'll tell you also, if you look at these points carefully and count them, you will find that only about 1/3 of the points are missed by more than 8.5 points. And that means the prediction is pretty good. Now I would welcome a few questions on this.
What's the correlation?
Can't the same results be achieved if instead of assuming 100% genetic control, if you assume 100% environmental control in the sense of that the IQ of the parents, what you're plotting on the graph there on the x coordinate is the correlation between the IQ of the parents, the natural parents, and the IQ of the children.
That's a good no, that's a good suggestion, but actually quantitatively it's wrong. If you did do this with the, it's not done that way. If you did do this with the IQ of the parents, the predictions would be nowhere nearly so good. There would be the miss would be much bigger. No, it's done another way. Other question? How is it done? This is my first evidence of thought block. There is only one way it can be done, and every psychology major, and probably 3/4 of the rest of everyone in the audience, knows what that one way is. And yet, when it's presented in this context, the thought block occurs. This is a consequence of the research taboos, so that you don't recognize it. Now, at this point, just for fun, how many? There are probably, typically in a group of this size, there will probably be the order of 4 or 5 people, maybe not that many now, who actually know for sure how this is done. Some of them may have read my paper or other papers, and I just like to, for fun, I don't want you to say, because I'd like to use my pedagogy on this for a few moments longer. How many of you think you really know the only way it could be done? Could you put your hand up and wave it? How could one possibly make that prediction that accurately? Anybody know? You think you know? Well, and there really is only one way, isn't it?
You're trying to make an assumption that you're predicting by percentage of white blood?
No.
Good.
No, that's these. I said these were all Caucasians. Well, I'm surprised. Doesn't anybody know? Do you? You know what? Well.
A rather limited range of environmental variance.
That is correct. It is a limited range, but it is a typical sample of the range for those Caucasians. And so when I state this, I state it saying that this geneticity from this data is found to be about 80% for a group like that. You know how it's done actually? What is it?
Adaptation from twin studies of identical twins.
That is the only way it can be done, and that is the way it.
What that is you're making one measurement, which is a measurement of IQ, and you have two covariant variables. One is genetic, and the other is environmental. And tell me, how do you separate that with one measurement?
I'm glad you asked that question. May we have the overhead projector in the middle of the stage now? We'll go to the overhead projector. That's exactly how it's done. Could we have this in, have the overhead projector on? He says, you're dealing with two variables, and how can you possibly separate two variables with one measurement? And that is done by complicated statistical methods, but we are going to do it so you can understand how it can be done with a deck of cards, and you can go off and do it yourself. The last time I spoke to a college audience on this, actually I had one of our office helpers do this presentation with the cards. She had the initiative to do it in her own biology class. After she had finished, she couldn't answer all of the questions. She couldn't answer the things about how you make the normal distribution on the cards, but the rest of it she did quite well. I explained that her biology class was in the 10th grade in Los Altos High School. So this is the level at which it's possible to do this. Could I have you and Gabe and Jeff up here? Now here is the same data that you've seen on the overhead projector. But now we are going to make a set of twins, and we are going to make them. We'll make a few so you can get the idea, and then I'll show you what happens if you were to do 122. We're going to make a set of twins with a geneticity of 60%. That is, 3 of whatever it is that pushes their IQ around, they're going to have in common, and 2 they're going to have separately. And here is the deck of cards. Let's see, you aren't, but you're part of the. Would you just pull 3 cards out of there at random? Actually, I can use 3 people or so here. I'd just as soon get my cards back. The deck is not quite full. Would you give those to Gabe, and then would you give 2 to Jeff? Gabe, would you add up your 3 cards algebraically? What were they? Just tell me aloud. You have a +4, a -3, and a 0. That means, in this case, the genes happen to push the IQ up 1 point. Now, what are your 2? Your 2 are 1. So that means the 2 environmental cards gave an IQ of contribution of 1. So that means that will be our predicted IQ for the first twin, is therefore 102, right? You got got 1 unit of genetics and 1 unit of environment. Now would you pull 2 more cards for the environment of the second twin, who was independently put into a separate environment? What do you get there? What you get minus 3. 7 minus 10 plus 7 is -3. So that means one of them was 102. The predicted one was 102, and the other one was -3, 107. That would put it there. So that represents what would have happened by this one chance shake of the genetic dice cup and the environmental placing. Now would you please repeat?
3 more?
3 more. 3 more, and 2 and 2. Are you getting the idea? Is this making sense? You see, what we're artificially doing is saying that these things which push IQ around, 3 of those units the twins have in common. That's the genes. One of them gets 2 units, and the other one gets a different 2 units of push, which would be the case, which would be what you should have if genes are accounting for 60% of the story and environment of 40%. All right, what did you get for your 3 this time?
He's got 3. I got 0.
You got 0.
Yeah.
And a 0. So we got 0 for the genes on that one, and what did you get for the 2 environment? -9. And the other 2? -4. Now would you pick up another, do this thing again, shuffle them up a bit. So this means the first twin was an IQ of 91, so that means that we'd have been predicting 9 points below the 100, or 91, and the second one ended up 96. So we have 91, that is here, and 96 is there. You see, we are now making up random sets of genes, random sets of environments, but with a ratio of 60% geneticity.
Is this? Where do you get that ratio?
What we're doing is going to do this by trial and error, you see. We could try 60% geneticity, 40% geneticity, 80% geneticity, 100% geneticity. How would we do this if we were going to try for 100% geneticity? Can you guess? That's right, and they both get the same. And where would the points fall if you did that? Right, on the line. So what we're doing is by trial and error finding out what geneticity will best fit the actual data, which you've seen. Yes?
Excuse me, I take it that you're taking environmental factors of IQ and genetic factors of IQ as being undetermined variables, and you're trying to, on a process of mathematical chance or statistics, to determine which is where.
That is correct. What he said was you're taking genes and IQ as unknown variables, or really more precisely the amount, the relative contributions as unknown variables, and then we're putting them together by chance to find what fits best. That's exactly what we're doing, and the mathematical name for this is analysis of variance, and you get involved with covariance and correlation coefficients, and then the professionals may tend to snow you on this, and you don't know whether to believe it or not. But my point is, you can do this with a deck of cards, and you could have done it equally well by flipping coins and assigning, say, 15, using 100 coins and assigning them the same ratio.
Yeah, but then you're talking about a mathematical distribution which might not necessarily correspond to what's realistically there.
But the fitting of a real phenomenon with mathematics is one of the standard tools, of course, of a theoretical science. And it doesn't necessarily show that the answer is always right. But if it gets to the state where one can reliably predict and reliably sort out, then one may have made a theory which is usable, even if it weren't true. It might be usable for engineering applications.
Shockley, you're making a correlation there, which means you can predict from your assumed 100% genetic control to the actual observed IQ.
Yes.
By making a correlation, you can only predict. How do you infer the causation?
Well, we know that the identical twins have the same genes. What we're finding out is how much of what pushes the IQ around is not common to the two, and that we're finding out by the deck of cards. And what is not common to the two are the different environments in which they're raised. And
most monozygotic twins, white twins, when they're separated, are not put in different environments that you are attempting.
that's a separate slide, and I can deal with that point if I have time. But this, that's about the 4th slide further on, is an analysis of that in terms of Sir Cyril Burt's data. And that argument that the commonness of the environment is what controls it simply does not stand up. But I can't answer that one now. Have we got another pair of twins here so you can get... by the way, do you see how this is going? Does it make sense? This depends on how open the mind is.
We've been talking now for 56 minutes.
I would say it's about 25 minutes of continuous lecture.
Well, in any event, I'm not going to quarrel with you with numbers or you about the way you play card games. My question is instead.
I'm sorry, but I have the floor, and I'm going to continue this, and if your question bears on this, I'll deal with it.
Let's have our question and answer period before the hour is up.
My question, sir, is this.
50 minutes.
My question is this. We've been talking about what pushes IQ around, and we've been allowing you to play games with an assumption that IQ and intelligence are closely related. In fact, tests show that intelligence is not the most important factor.
Your tests?
You can heckle me like that, that's fine. I don't have a microphone, but I'll keep asking the question.
While he's talking, will you just run the slides through slowly, one by one?
My question is this. I want you to comment on a particular test by which some 30 or so children were given a test that was potentially meaningless. Certain children were picked at...
This is the Rosenthal, Jacobson, Pygmalion in the classroom study, is it not?
Okay. I know it's wrong.
The answer to the question is that's been one of the most abused and criticized studies that's appeared in psychology. Read Thorndike on it, read Jensen on it, read Kronbach on it.
Can I ask you a question?
If you let him ask the question, there won't be any trouble. I'll answer it, and then we can go on.
I've read Kronbach, and I've read Jensen, and I've read maybe not your complete works, but enough of them. Now my question, now, and for those other people in the audience who want to know about the question, I want to describe the test, and I want him to comment on the test. Now the test was this. A test was administered to students, not high school students. Students were and certain students were picked at random, and the teachers were told that these students were going to receive a dramatic rise in IQ. The effect of that was to create an attitude toward those students in the minds of teachers that was extremely favorable. Those students were given special attention. Those students received IQ ranges which on the average were above the difference that this fellow talks about as being among racial groups. Now the question, 27 points. Now you don't get that result by shuffling cards and playing a card game. Now the question is, and the point of this whole study is that the key thing in intelligence, in how you do an intelligence test, and there are about 7 or 8 other studies that I could cite, is motivation first. They found that in tests where kids get to know the person who's giving the test, IQs go up higher. Now these have nothing to do with genetics. And the point about what this fellow is trying to do is to create an attitude in the minds of teachers all over the country which will enable them and put them in a position of viewing test scores lower on certain kinds of children, like black, working class, ghetto children. What's your question? The question is what about point is, what is the effect of your life on the attitudes of teachers toward students?
Okay, now let him answer the question.
Well, the study to which the gentleman was referring, I think, is almost certainly the Jacobson, Rosenthal, Pygmalion in the classroom. Is that correct? And you think that Thorndike's objection to this is unsound? Thorndike, examining the tables in this study, finds that the purported results in this book, Pygmalion in the Classroom, simply could not have occurred under the circumstances which the authors claimed they occurred. That is, the rises which they had would have been possible in terms of the end scores which they reported only if the students had been essentially in a moron group to begin with. And the study reports them as not being that. Thorndike says that when, that is the two, he did not ask one question, but two questions. One question was, what about this study? And the second question was, based on the assumption that this study is sound, what evil will you do by what you are talking about, by the ideas that you plant? And that second question is, in my opinion, entirely in keeping with the fascist, Nazi, totalitarian criticism that I level at the SDS group, in which they are unwilling to reason, you see. You've delayed the presentation of material here by the heckling that has gone on. This is, I'll just incidentally mention my debate challenge, which I'm going to try to formalize with the SDS at Harvard and with other SDS groups, and that is this. I will sit at a table with one person who will debate with me and with one of these high-speed chess timing devices. And the rule will be no one must get more than 5 minutes ahead of the other. If he gets more than 5 minutes ahead, the microphone has to be handed back. But as soon as you've asked your question, you can turn the microphone over to the other fellow and he can answer or not as he wants. But so that it will be a conservation of total amount of time, but it won't be these non-productive failure to follow something up logically.
I got a question. Your basic assumption in this, well, you haven't mentioned racism.
By the way, could we go through these slides, just run them through? Somebody who's interested in them can see them.
Okay, your basic assumption was that there is...
By the way, that's if you use 4 environmental and 1 genetic, and it looks like the data, and if you use 4 genetic, 1 environmental, thank you. You know, he can read. I'm willing to respond. By the way, Mr. Gable, I don't say I answer questions. I respond to questions. There's some questions that I certainly find unanswerable.
If you give him a chance to go through the slides, we will have a question and answer period followed.
May I?
Okay.
May the black gentleman have the floor?
Of course. If you remember me, and I remember the symposium we were 15 years ago with Dr. Du Bois at the University of Pennsylvania.
15 years ago?
Right. The reason why I asked...
I don't remember such a... That would be 1957?
1950. Right.
Was this... well, maybe he was there. Was Lashley there?
We were all there, and if you remember... I just wanted to ask you one thing. I know the young men quite simply made the statement that you've been playing statistical games here, using quantitative analysis through certain variables, not even mentioning those intervening variables. But the only thing what I'm saying is that, as you know, Dr. Du Bois died. He was ran out of his country and so forth since that time. How is it you're still here?
Well, I will respond by saying I'm here because I understood I was going to come to the University of California at Los Angeles to speak on geneticity of IQ,
Right.
and not on other subjects. But I don't remember this.
Why I ask you this because you knew Dr. Du Bois. So did I.
I don't recall this meeting, and I think I would.
Yes,
What was the occasion of this?
The occasion was the time was the dealing with the anthropological study there.
No, this is almost impossible because my serious interest in this came in 1965,
Yes,
and not that early.
You were there with, from the University of Pennsylvania at the same time in Philadelphia.
I happened to be there, but did I attend the meeting? I have no recollection of this whatever.
Well, I only asked that one question, if you would care to answer that.
I don't think he can.
Not using statistical analysis or quantitative analysis.
Well, I will, having thought this over for a moment, I will say one of the reasons I'm in this country, rather than leaving it, has to do with these 3 moral postulates I talked about. I believe I am functioning in the most humane way of any of the intellectuals I know.
Sterilization of welfare mothers, right? That's humane.
Because he's black?
This is that voluntary sterilization bonus plan, which incidentally was independently invented by Sir Francis Crick, who has never made any publication of it. Earlier than that, facetiously by H.L. Mencken. That plan reads, bonuses...
There's another question first. Well, you asked one also.
I think my answer was that the question was placed in a form in which it does not relate to my statement of the voluntary sterilization bonus plan in at least two regards. The first one of which is, I do not propose this or advocate this for action. I advocate it for thinking about, and I advocate it for thinking about for a very specific reason, that if you say anything that remotely has anything to do with eugenics, the answer is that's what Hitler tried, isn't it? And that frequently blocks the mind to the point, just like the idea that genes control IQ blocks the mind, to the point that people can't think. So I'm saying this is the thing which ought to be gotten out and thought about. What is wrong with it, actually, if I turn the question back and ask you? I haven't found anything really very wrong with it.
You said that there's no attitude change caused by your study or by Jensen's.
You're changing the subject now. We're talking about this.
No, answer my question. You said there's no attitude change. Nixon gave his entire cabinet your study and Jensen's study to read and know. And right after that happened is when Nixon came out with his anti-busing act. Now you say there's no attitude change? What about it?
I don't recall saying there's no attitude change.
5 minutes ago you said no attitude change were you concerned with. Well, there is an attitude change, and that's why we object to your right to speak. But you're just feeding the racists.
Well, I would like to feed the intellectuals so they would take some responsibility on sorting this out, because I think that as I've said before, what our welfare programs may be doing is one of the cruelest things that's been done to a minority group. If indeed these things that I worry about and which are studyable and could be studied here at UCLA in the black population of UCLA, for example, which is presumably the degree of racism does not vary greatly from one black to another in UCLA, would be to divide the black student body into upper and lower parts and find out if these genetic racial factors I wonder about do indeed hold. And if they do hold, and we are unwittingly encouraging with our intention some of the least capable elements of the black minority to have the most children, then this is a form of genetic enslavement. If their greatest capability simply consists of being able to produce the largest number of children, to encourage that is unkind to the children. It does not fit my concern postulate. I'm not an expert on Lamarckian theory.
What's the cutoff point? What's the lowest IQ we can tolerate without sterilization?
This was voluntary, and the person with a low IQ, but with determination and a love for children and someone to support him, this kind of person would certainly not take the bonus. So this is not compulsory.
Sir, as you know, any system can be built on false pretenses. As an example, you can build a system out of a postulate such as E equals MC cubed, although the results of that system may be completely false. The system can be worked out, can be determined. Now, you have said a lot about IQ. In fact, as far as I can tell, IQ is one of the basic...
Next, this slide here is one of the telling slides that happens to be relevant. Hold that slide.
So what I was saying is that IQ is one of the bases of your whole theory. Now, what I'm saying is, what I believe is that you have not, to me, proved that IQ is an accurate evaluation of intelligence. And without that proof, sir, your entire theory is false and is untrue.
Just a second. There is a question before the floor. And Mr. Elias, you've been saying answer his questions. Would you mind stepping to the microphone and stating that question for me?
I don't know what to say.
Will you ascertain the question?
How's that going to help you answering?
The question does not make sense to me. Your remark on it didn't make sense.
Why don't you repeat your question?
What is the proof that the IQ tests for intelligence, native intelligence, as thought of by people as being, mental capacity? Where's the proof of that?
I know of no proof of that, and I do not use that which you have stated as an assumption in the analysis.
But you're building the entire theory on the analysis of IQ tests.
That is correct. Not entirely. It's based on other things.
Aren't you correlating the passage of children with IQ?
I can comment on this, but you don't want to hear comments. You want to phrase your own questions your own way. You want me to tell you this one? All right. I will deal with IQ tests. That would have been my second point. The first is IQ test scores are genetically controlled 80%. That's the first analysis. It does not say whether IQ means a damn thing. It's independent of that. I'm going to come to the second point now.
Let him finish.
I am going to
finish the question.
See, this is exactly the business I'm saying, why I want to do this chess timer. Because you don't have a chance to deal with one question. Nobody gives a damn whether you answer that question. They just want to shoot at you with the next one. Now, the question I am addressing myself to is, what about IQ? IQ, so what? Now, I take it that is a reasonable question. IQ, so what, is a reasonable question to answer in respect to these questions that I've asked. I would like to have a showing of hands of people who feel it is reasonable and want me to try to answer it. How many people don't want me to answer it, want to go on to something else? I don't get chances.
You people would stop, if you'd stop interrupting him, he'd answer the question. Every time you ask a question, somebody interrupts with another question. How can he answer one when there's someone else talking? You want to ask a question, he's here. Give him a chance. There you go again.
How are we voting to make him answer the question?
Why don't you shut up and let him answer it? There's enough people here that want to hear him. You're the one that asked the question. Let him answer it. Okay, now if you have a question, you get up one at a time, you ask it to him, and I'm sure he'll give you the courtesy of answering it, or trying to.
Don't let him off the hook. Let him answer. I want him.
Mr. Elias, will you stand at the podium and chair this meeting? I will speak when you tell me to speak.
Okay. Did you hear the question before?
Yes, I've heard the question.
Would you please answer that question, if you can?
I can't answer that question. I can speak on the topic I mentioned. It is relevant to the question.
Well, our time is running out, Dr. Shockley, and the students here are interested in a question and answer period. We were wondering, would you please give the students here courtesy of letting them ask you a few questions for about 10 minutes and you answering those questions before our program runs out?
Mr. Elias, at this point I am unsatisfied with your chairmanship. The question was... The question was, what about IQ? I thought there was interest in this. It was directed towards it, and you are not prepared to have me discuss what about IQ. You want me to answer a specific question that is not...
Dr. Shockley, maybe I have a misunderstanding of the way this program is run, but doing it throughout the year, I bring speakers here to the enjoyment of the students, and any person that gets up on this podium is here to answer questions from the students.
Will you ask the question to me yourself then, and I will try to answer it.
And I believe that if these students
I will deal
are here,
with that question if you like.
If they're interested and they're willing to ask you questions, you should answer them. Now, if you people are going to be loud, there's no point to it, and we'll stop it. But if you are interested and you're willing to ask questions one at a time, we will try to go on with the program for a little bit longer. Okay, so...
Well, this question was a pointed question on the point. He asked, is IQ correlated with humaneness? I can speak to that question.
Can you answer the first question?
Correlated to intelligence.
Is IQ...
I do not know how to define intelligence unambiguously. I do not attempt to correlate IQ with an abstract concept of intelligence.
Okay, next question. That's it for the question. Next question. There's a gentleman waiting right there.
Based on that, which is the whole assumption about this genetic environmental nonsense, is that IQ measures intelligence. Therefore, since we have here a man who claims to be a professor and who goes around lecturing all around the country with charts like this about a concept which in fact he is unwilling to define when asked about it, then I think...
If you have a question...
Then I think we'll have to ask the following question. If perhaps his motivation is not the sincere concern for humanity, which he professes so lavishly, but in fact what it is that for Bell Telephone and others, he runs around trying to...
Don't tell him what he is. Do you have a question? Do we have the other next question? Right back there, the gentleman with the beard. There's a question right there. Go ahead.
Do you take into account the fact that, for example, inadequate nutrition of the mother of the twins will cause the twins to have a lower IQ, even if they're raised in different parts of the country, so that the parents of the twins in the lower part of your graph
conclusion because a simple mathematical picture turns out to give consistent results, and it is also not necessary to deal with identical twins.
Next question. Right there.
When dealing with such a tenuous subject as the correlation between intelligence and IQ and utilizing this in survival factor, is it possible that your ideas, as they're presented here, could be seized upon by an extremely racist group and utilized to propagate all forms of racism within the United States? And do you consider that when you're presenting these ideas?
I place my emphasis upon what I regard as being these intellectually important problems. I think all powerful instruments can be misused.
Next question. David.
Professor Shockley, as I understand what I've heard you say about the concept of correlation of something and IQ, you're concerned with the correlation between acculturation and IQ. Is this your position? If this is your position, you consider it really a valid sociological question?
I consider it as a valid sociological conclusion to conclude that what is measured by IQ is correlated with other estimable human behavior traits of a wide variety of kinds, with correlation coefficients varying from about 0.3 to 0.5. This particular one here is about 0.7, and that's the IQ of the children as correlated with the IQ, well, not correlated with the IQ, but it leads to that from this data for the children of the term and gifted group.
Question over there.
The question was, am I saying that blacks cannot assimilate? One of the important items in the studies which I've done on racial differences involves correlation of capacities, different kinds of capacities, particularly in the Coleman study, of different abilities between blacks and whites. One of the items in terms of assimilating and regurgitating, the evidence on that, to the best of my knowledge, is that black children have comparable digit spans, ability to remember a series of 7 digits or so and regurgitate these, tell them back, quite comparable to whites and with comparable distributions. For whites, the digit span ability is correlated about 0.7 with Stanford Binet IQ, and for blacks more like 0.25. These appear to me to be some of the evidence for significant differences in basic mental patterns, and these may depend upon racial mix.
Okay, question over there.
Yeah, so can you go back about the 2 slides? Because the blue slide up there with 3 statements on it, but my question pertains to that. That kind of passed quickly.
Could you do that, please? The blue slide.
If that slide is going to be shown, that's a part of the lecture, and I would like to, before it's put on, make some remarks about it.
Is that all right with you? Okay.
I would like to say this slide is a slide which has to do with whether or not an audience believes in evolution. And the slide, by the way, how many did you actually read it? Anybody read it? You did, yeah. Well, the slide says, consider the whole evolutionary scale since time began, and modern man and all the forms of life from which he descended, And then it says, essentially it asks, do you believe that, that vision, appreciation of music, anything like this is really an asset? And these things, certainly ability to think, ability to invent language, do these things, depends upon genes. Therefore, certainly one can say somewhere from the earliest amoeba-like progenitor of man up to the present time, there must have been an improvement in the genetic quality of the human species. It isn't simply restricted, you see, to present-day man. Now then, I show this slide and I ask people if they will take a position or whether they agree with this. Now, so I would like now to ask people who did not read this slide before, please to read it and see if they don't feel the correct answer is inevitably yes. There must have been an improvement in genetic quality of a meaningful sort, such as ability to see, to have color vision and so on, which must have come somewhere, and understand music. Now, the people who did not read the slide as it went through before, could I have a showing of hands of how many agree with it, if anyone? How many disagree with it who did not read it before? I see no one who having heard my explanation, disagrees. Now then, what is your reaction?
My question is, if we're talking about the genetic development of man, what happened with the development of the African nations in the early period of modern era, when they were far superior to the European nations and were in fact superior until they were defeated by the European nations for imperialistic purposes and economic purposes and brought here to be cotton pickers?
I question the accuracy of the historical data. It's not an area of my expertise, but what data I have run into does not agree with the premises of your question.
All right, then let me finish. I taught in elementary school for 4 years with black students, and one of the really important things when we started to study was the black history. And it certainly seemed and verified that the development of the black nations, the black empires, and the University of Timbuktu was so highly developed that the European nations couldn't even understand what the hell was going on in Africa at the time.
Might I ask, in that study, did you find out if these nations, at the time they reached the peak of their civilization, developed extensive welfare programs?
The Greeks, the Romans, they didn't need them.
You're interrupting again. If you want to continue.
Not an area of my expertise, not a subject on which I would take my comments very seriously.
Can I send you a book list to read then?
I use methods of research which I found valuable in the past in operations research during World War II, which involves applying certain statistical capacities in areas of subject matter that may be strange. If these books fit in that way, I may be able to use them. Otherwise, they might not be useful to me.
Gentleman way back there.
There are many factors in the environment which the human animal must deal with to survive, only one of which is intelligence. It seems that the assumptions you go by in your studies are all based on the fact that man must have high intelligence to survive well in our society. Well, what about the other factors that influence his survival and his happiness, such as compassion and generosity? Don't those affect his success as in survival? And has your studies taken these into account at all?
My studies take these into account, especially in the direction related to the question that was raised here a long time ago of is humaneness correlated with IQ? The study of the term and gifted group, who were picked so as to be about 3 standard deviations, average IQ of 151, above the average of the population, shows that in all sorts of measures, of which that slide with the IQ distribution of the children is one, another one is the earned income, another one is the relatively small incidence of alcoholism, smaller incidence of divorces, and so on. Humaneness per se, I don't know. In terms of adopting children, they did adopt children, and the adopted children did very well, but nowhere nearly as well as the natural children. All of these things indicate to me that the sorts of factors you are talking about are correlated with IQ. I don't know how you measure these. IQ is the easiest one to measure, and in this regard, it is something like the clinical thermometer. It tells you something, it gives you signals, but you don't diagnose a man simply by his temperature. There may be nothing wrong except he's been too long in a sauna bath.
I'm really sorry the time is up. We really went over time, and we did have a question-answer period, so goodbye. I'm sorry, you know.
I would like to answer this blue-shirted question here because he didn't get a fair deal a while ago.
Go ahead.
What I gather from this is that we sort of should revert to, some sort of formalized law of the jungle. I mean, in selecting out the lower types, the inferiors on whatever basis so that the species can survive and prosper. Now, mightn't you argue against penicillin on that same basis, that the most resistant species? I mean, nobody gets administered drugs, and then the best ones survive, and a lot of other so-called modern.
So I repeat the question. The question was the sort of thing I'm talking about. Maybe what I'm advocating is going back to the law of the jungle so that one will kill off the weaklings and improve the quality. And that is an unwarranted jump. I'm glad you asked the question. It's one that could be drawn, and in terms of the way the discussion has gone, I might inadvertently have said things that even sound like that. I carefully say the objective is to find humane ways, just as we have with the population explosion. 12 years ago, the population explosion, the notion that we should do anything about that was almost as abhorrent, that quantity problem was almost as abhorrent as the quality problem. But we now face the fact that modern developments, especially of medicine, means that we must face the fact we've got a population explosion. We must try to find humane answers. Birth control. In 1965 or 4, I had taken a firm position on liberalizing abortion laws. I'd like to take credit for that one. Those things have come in that time, and I'm saying what we may now are not facing is that we may be doing something just as bad, just as inhumane as the population explosion in terms of what we're doing with the quality problem. And we shouldn't go back to the laws of the jungle. We should try to find humane answers. And what's the matter with the voluntary sterilization bonus plan? It might be a humane answer. I don't know, but if you can't discuss it without having flag waving and shouting and so on, how can you find out whether it's good or not? So that's my main thesis. The area has taboos, and we're not thinking. No fooling.
Thank you very much for coming. I really enjoyed listening to what you said when you were able to talk.